Welcome back to a new edition of the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life. Coping with the struggle of life. In this segment, I want to talk about one of the values and advantages, what I like to call the Shinsei Advantage or the Shinsei difference, for the Shinsei method as a life principle method of self-training. I developed the Shinsei method really to be a method of self-analysis that allows you to establish a reference for yourself, because I found it to be so crucial for everyday life, in business and life and family, with various experiences in all of those areas. I found that there's not a lot of explanations and not a lot of direction and advice, practical advice, for how to deal with some of the more challenging aspects of life. Now, when I was studying in a specific self-defense class, I continued to train and study in martial arts, the Art of Bushido, or the practice of Bushido. Do means way, when translated from the Japanese loosely to mean way. Bushi, with a samurai, Bushido is really a body of knowledge that allows you to be able not just to study martial arts or the martial combat, but also personal development, so that you can combine both martial experience and martial prowess expertise with a strong self-awareness to ultimately create a better warrior. That's what the concept was behind Bushido. And I found that to be a very influential and impactful approach for the development of the Shinsei method, particularly for purposes of inner development, because it's inner development that gets so little attention in many social settings, and in fact it gets a lot of discouragement even when you establish a way of self-analysis, self-development for yourself. And that really was one of the functions and goals of the Shinsei method when I developed it. Now, when I was studying in self-defense, I had to write a publishable thesis. That was one of the requirements for achieving a black belt in that particular system. And it was a very good requirement, I felt, because it gave all students, but particularly me, because I took it very seriously, as I do with everything. I took it very seriously, and it gave me an opportunity to really delve into the topic of self-defense, hand-to-hand combat, warrior doctrine or warrior philosophy, the philosophy of war, and a lot of aspects that I found to be very influential. And one of the things that I thought at that time that characterized life was that life was war. And why did I think that? I thought that because so much of the violence, so much of the discouragement, so much of the abuse in many cases, and I can speak with from direct experience from that, so many of the things in life seem to be oriented toward conflict. And I felt that in training in self-defense and learning those fundamental principles, it helped you to be able to deal with some of those conflict in everyday life and in your social experiences. Now, to a certain extent, that's true, because the philosophy of self-defense really creates a mentality and mindset of preparedness, so that it really allows you to be able to see certain things and certain threats and challenges in a way, or really to be able to provide a way for you to create for yourself a way to handle it in advance. In other words, when you study in self-defense, one of the most important elements and aspects of self-defense is preparedness, to be prepared through training and thinking about training in the various scenarios that you may be faced with in your everyday life. In that particular case, if you're threatened by an unwanted attacker, or threatened by unprovoked violence, which you very often may be faced with in this day and age, and I'll get to that in a minute, because that really highlights what I wanted to talk about in this segment of the show, because very often you don't ever know. You don't always know, and very often you rarely know when you could be confronted with violence. So since you never really know when you might be confronted with that kind of extreme conflict, it's very important to be prepared for that in advance, and thinking about that in advance through thinking about appropriate responses, appropriate techniques, appropriate reactions, and what to do overall. And really, more importantly, this is one of the things that my previous teacher stressed, which For martial arts and self-defense, he was one of the best. But one of the things that he highlighted in his school was the mindset and the mentality and the will to respond was very often one of the most difficult hurdles that people had to overcome when they had to respond to a violent encounter. And I found that to be very insightful and very helpful, not just for self-defense, but for everyday life. Because very often what happens is, in many social settings, you are discouraged from creating a level of inner strength and a balanced self-trust, particularly self-trust. You're discouraged from developing a level of independence, of thinking for yourself, of evaluating reality, of evaluating events, of looking at things objectively so that you can develop a practical and workable plan. Now think about that from the perspective of the Shinsei method and really from a personal perspective. What I've just highlighted, and that really was the topic of the thesis that I wrote, that the application of self-defense to everyday life. Because I've found that when you're talking about everyday life and a lot of the things that you face with, self-defense is directly applicable. And I found it to be very useful and helpful in developing a strategy for living. Not so much that life is war. In some ways it is, and in a lot of ways it is, because a lot of people are conflictual and combative. Now, war, of course, is a very extreme case. Self-defense, when you're faced with a violent encounter, is an extreme case, and you don't always face that. But you're often faced with a lot of conflict, a lot of abuse, a lot of abusive remarks, a lot of derogatory and demeaning remarks against you, perhaps your family members, people that you care for. A lot of things you see in the news and media, they often get into this sort of thing, particularly if you have a particular philosophy. Let's say you have a conservative philosophy. There's a lot of beating up on conservatives that go on because, unfortunately, a lot of the media tends to be on the left side, left-leaning side. And rather than being objective, it becomes very emotional. So they tend to denigrate and downgrade or deride people just because they have a very different view, rather than understanding their views or just respecting the views and allowing those views to coexist. Of course, that's the basis of the American constitutional republic. To really, and that's really the basis of the First Amendment, of course, is to be able to allow viewpoints that you may not agree with to coexist. As long as they don't cross the line with violence, then you should be able to coexist. Even though you may not subscribe to what they believe in, they have a right to believe their own views. And if you don't want to listen to those views and you don't want to partake in those views, of course you have the right to disengage. And what I've found, though, is that in many social settings, you really need a philosophy and a mindset that I felt was more akin to self-defense, because very often in many social settings I have found people can be very provocative. They can be very belligerent. They can be very abusive. And you run the gamut from the workplace to the family to the education. I have been in college classes where I've had professors call me and things that I've done stupid. Now think about that for a second. As a young child or as a youngster, at that time I was in my 20s, early 20s, even though I had a fair amount of self-trust, or inner strength I should say, not so much self-trust, that came a little bit later and I'm still working on that. But I had a little bit more self or inner strength and inner balance perhaps than my colleagues at the time. Now that could have been devastating for someone to be told that what you're doing is something that you believe in, because obviously this was in a political science course and in an international relations class. And by the way, it was in graduate school. This was not in the beginning stages. This was in graduate school. It was a graduate level professor. And he called what I said stupid simply because he didn't agree with it. And it was very hurtful, obviously. I was very angry. And in fact, I pulled out of that class and I pulled out of the whole program because of the reactions that I found and that I faced with when I complained about his reaction. They kind of laughed, they chuckled, they thought it was humorous that he would say that. Of course, they gave me the perfunctory and the gratuitous apology. At least his boss did. He didn't, but his boss did. But it was very unsatisfactory because they didn't really believe what they were saying. They felt, I assumed, that it was perfectly legitimate to call someone stupid and call their work stupid if you didn't agree with it, if you didn't subscribe to what they were saying. Rather than, I might add. Now, in a school setting, this would be the proper approach. If you really believe that something that a student is saying is inappropriate or is not up to the level or the standard that you want to establish, that's the opportunity to show them the right way, in quotes, or an alternative to what they're presenting, rather than calling it stupid and just dismissing it offhand, like you're just discarding the person out of hand. Now, that's a very demeaning, derogatory, and confrontational situation, but it's very common, I found, in many social settings. And so what I was thinking at the time when I was developing that thesis in self-defense is that life is war. And it required an attitude in response to that would allow you to be prepared for just those kind of situations. When people call you stupid, when they are dismissive of something, even if you're making a sincere effort to improve, as I've often found in many work settings. You want to improve the work setting. Maybe you believe in what the company says. We want you to be innovative. We want you to be creative. We like the innovation in you. We want to bring out the innovation in you for our customers because customer service is our number one priority. And then you take that to heart. You take that sincerely because sincerity, thriftiness, kindness, reverence, these are all important to you, important principles, as I've talked about in previous segments of the show, which you can find at the shinseimethod.com or at the Shinsei Method YouTube channel. But you believe in that. You believe in what they're telling you, that you want to be innovative for the company. You try that. And I'm speaking from experience, by the way. You try that. And then you get these strange looks like, what are you doing that for? Yeah, we said that. This was the real message. We said that innovation is important, but we don't really mean it. We said that the college was the place or institution of higher learning, but we really didn't mean that. That's the constant message that you get in many social settings. So it became, to me, very obvious that it wasn't so much that applying a philosophy of war was important, maybe some of the principles in dealing with that, depending on the severity of the situation. But what was more important was preparedness. That's what was important in many social settings, to be prepared. And in order to be prepared in many social settings, it's important to understand something about you, something about your values, your views, your policies, practices, and procedures, so that you can understand what values are important to you, what views you hold, what your policies are, and to come to a realization of why you hold those views, those values, and those policies. And then making that solid, making that your core of existence, your Bushido, in a sense, making that your core of existence, so that when you are confronted with many of these social situations, you're not so discouraged by it. Because I have been there too, where people have said certain things, they've done certain things. I've done things in work settings to try to be innovative and try to promote the company, and then really get shot down in really very direct ways. I've been in one job where I was smacked on the back. So sometimes it can even be violent. That brings me to what I wanted to talk about today, because a lot of people are talking about an event that recently happened during a broadcast of a yearly event that a lot of people apparently watch. Maybe sometimes it's been said that more than 1 billion people worldwide watch this live telecast. Now, I don't watch it because I don't subscribe to many of the movies that come out of Hollywood these days. Up until the 1950s, when they promoted much more sensible values, and many of the actors that were influential and inspirational to me, people like James Cagney, Clark Gable, Humphrey Bogart to some degree, but particularly James Cagney, Clark Gable, and Errol Flynn. These types of people were very influential to me from a very young age until later. And so Hollywood is very different today. They don't promote that. They promote values that are completely contrary to what I believe in and what I talk about on this show and at the shinseimethod.com. They're completely contrary to principle, so I don't watch that usually. It has become widely talked about, so I wanted to mention it on this show because it highlights something that's very important for the purposes of the Shinsei method. Now, apparently, during this international broadcast that really employs a lot of people, that a lot of people watch, that has a lot of money at stake, that is presenting an award that many people don't receive, and if they do receive it, it's once in a lifetime. So for that industry, the Academy Awards represent something very important. At least it should. It would be the equivalent of you achieving an award of excellence in your given profession if you receive one at a meeting, maybe in your professional field or in your office or workplace. If you get a high mark, let's say on an SAT, and you're a student, you get a high mark on an SAT or an MCAT or an LSAT, and you're awarded an admission letter to a school that you want to go to, that's an important thing. Now, it may not be as important to me for reasons that I often talk about on the show and at the ShinseiMethod.com because of what goes on in many college classrooms. I talked about one thing that happened to me personally, and that's not unique. It still continues to this day. In fact, it's a lot worse. But okay, if that's important to you, obviously an admission letter for a reputable school is an important thing. A graduation ceremony from a college or university or even a high school is an important thing. It's a ceremony. You have to wear a cap and gown usually. You get a diploma. Diploma is supposed to mean something. And when I went through that process, it was important to me even at that time. It is an important symbol. So think about this for a second. Now, this individual, this actor, apparently walked up on stage and slapped somebody in public. In other words, committed violence in public during this ceremony. And a lot of the people are talking about this event that went on. But I want to take a slightly different tact. For the purposes of the Shinsei method, I wanted to highlight one of the things that really creates the challenge of life. And this is what I started off this segment of the show talking about. Really dealing with the struggle of life and why life is a struggle sometimes, and very often it is. This actor is paid millions of dollars per contract every time that he goes into a film, because most of the films are they cost a lot of money. Big budget films, they cost a lot of money. They hire a lot of people. There's a lot of advertising. There are studios that are behind that employ a lot of people. A lot of people are responsible and have a responsibility to these films. Now, all of that goes on, is behind the awards of these in this particular ceremony. Same thing with the other awards that maybe aren't as famous, like I talked about. If you get a diploma, all of the things that go into that diploma, all of the people that are employed for the purposes of that diploma, what that represented in terms of the work that you put into, all of the years of your life you put into trying to learn a particular subject or gaining and earning that diploma, all of the sacrifices you made for that. And that applies to this award ceremony as well. All the sacrifices that people make, all of the people that didn't receive one, who have a better character and have more restraint, who are just as dedicated, perhaps, and have more talent in many ways. All of the people that did not get that award really you have some responsibility, or that award represents those people to some degree. All of that goes into, is my point, the value, or supposed to, the value of that award. People that put that ceremony on each year, they spend a lot of time doing that. They broadcast it a lot. Everyone knows it's a yearly event. And there's a lot of sacrifices that are made. There's a lot of dedication in order to put those ceremony, those shows on. There's a lot of camera people that have to broadcast that. Many television stations have to preempt their normal programming. All of that is going on when those award ceremonies happen. So when someone hands an award, like in the Academy Awards, to someone, it represents a lot of things. It represents a lot of value. And it's just that value that is completely cast aside by somebody who says, I don't like what someone said, so I'm going to walk up here and completely dismiss all of that value and slap this person in the face. In other words, commit an act of violence. Now, why do I mention all of that? I mention it to highlight a couple of things. Number one, the meaning of that kind of behavior. Number two, why it's so difficult for people like you in everyday life. And I'm speaking from personal experience because it's been very difficult for people like me. If you're the type of person that would never do anything like that, someone says something, and many people are provocative. I just mentioned a teacher that called me stupid. I didn't slap him. I didn't do anything physical. I went to his supervisor, and I expressed my dissatisfaction. And ultimately, I pulled out, which is what this actor could have done. If he didn't really like what the person was saying, he could have just got up and walked out. Or he could have complained to the organization about that. There's a lot of different things a person could have done in a very mature way, but he didn't do it. Now, I highlight this not to pick on this person so much, just because it's very famous at the moment. I wanted to highlight something that's very important for the Shinsei method. This actor that did that is paid a lot of money. There are a lot of people that rely on not just him, but all of the projects that he has worked on and the project that he got the award for, all of those projects that he works on, a lot of people rely on that. He has family. He has children. His children have friends. He has nephews and nieces, presumably. He has other family members that know him, etc. You have all this social structure that is expecting a certain level of decorum and conduct. And the person, as is very common, just dismisses all of that for a momentary impulse. Yet, he still gets all of these rewards. And that's what I wanted to highlight for this segment of the show. Because a lot of times what happens is, for good conduct, you get penalized, you get dismissed, you get discouraged, you get ignored and dismissed. For bad conduct, even bad conduct, and you can put that in quotes, define it for yourself, of course, if you want. But I think you have some idea of what bad conduct might be. Obviously, bad conduct is violence. When you smack someone, unless you are responding to a self-defense situation and you're defending yourself for some reason, outside of that situation, violence is not acceptable under most situations. Of course, there are provocations, but the law recognizes, and I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not offering legal advice, and I'm not offering any kind of advice, essentially, except life advice from personal experience. But from a common sense point of view, most laws, and I've read, and I've had to do this from a self-defense perspective, I've read the jury instructions for self-defense in my local region to understand what the law considers appropriate response to appropriate situations, appropriate threats, etc. And almost universally in almost every country, and I've studied this in many other countries as well, in virtually every country, it's recognized that you can't physically assault or commit battery against someone, no matter what the words are. Sticks and stones might break my bones, but words will never hurt me. There's some meaning to that. A lot of people say that, and they take it like it's a joke, but there's a lot of value to it. In other words, words cannot affect you. It does take a fair amount of self-restraint and self-discipline to prevent yourself from feeling the impulse or having the impulse from taking that kind of physical action against someone that's provoking you, because some people are very provocative. Let's face it. Because on the one hand, this culture encourages provocation. On the other hand, it encourages people to respond impulsively. And so most of the time what happens as a rational, objective person, you find yourself in the middle of all of that chaos and hysteria. And you have to navigate for yourself. Of course, you don't have to, but this is the purpose of the Shinsei method and why I'm bringing this whole scenario up. Otherwise, it's not as important. It's only so important so much as you realize that very often the conduct that people say is valid and valuable is very rarely the conduct that people often show. And if you are the person that takes people at face value, that self-restraint, self-discipline are important in social settings, and you demonstrate that, very often you'll find you're penalized for it. And the people that don't show that, like the person who walks up in front of millions of people, dismissing all the value that goes into and the professionalism that goes into that whole situation, dismisses it all for an impulse, very often those kinds of people are rewarded in handsome, very handsome terms, multi-million-dollar terms, living in luxurious lifestyles. And so you have that kind of topsy-turvy thing going on, particularly in America. And it becomes then very difficult to navigate toward a North Star, in other words, a true north, to having some level of true north. Even establishing this kind of a channel, this kind of a message, I wondered how relevant it would actually be today. Because establishing a way of looking at things, an orientation, a way, a perspective, a policy, a procedure that is oriented toward value, principle, life, strength, truth, justice, balance, integrity, self-trust, that doesn't seem to be terribly common and terribly popular, and very often it doesn't get much social recognition and social reward. Just the opposite does. That became, for me, the challenge of life and the challenge of living and the struggle of living. Because on the one hand, for me, it was important to follow value, to follow principle. These principles, to me, are very important and they mean something. But on the other hand, I have to be realistic. In many social settings, people could care less. So how do you establish a way of looking at things, an orientation, a mindset, a policy, practice, procedure, a mentality that really goes against the grain? Well, that really is what the Shinsei method is all about. Because ultimately, if you follow principle, if you follow a life principle in your life, most of the time you'll be swimming upstream, you'll be going against the grain, and you'll find that the rewards go to the people that are behaving in a completely contrary fashion. Even though what you may be doing, the principled approach, may be well publicized and well advertised, in practical terms, in reality terms, in other words, in deed and in action, the complete opposite is true. So do you throw those values away? That became, to me, one of the life questions. And I found the answer is emphatically no. I can only say emphatically now. If I had asked that question, let's say even a year ago, I wouldn't have been so emphatic, because I was in a position where I was throwing those values away. I was doubting those values. I was doubting myself because it wasn't getting any rewards. And if you're not going to get rewards, and yes, rewards are important. I don't mean material rewards. I mean a certain level of recognition. People just listening to you can be a reward. People taking what you're saying seriously can be a reward. People incorporating your ideas can be a reward. That's what I mean when I say not a lot of social support, because a lot of times people dismiss all of that. Even if you are saying exactly the same thing that's being said on the television, the radio, newspapers, and magazines. And so to establish a way for yourself that is solid in the level of self-trust, inner strength, inner balance, that's why I call it the 3 pillars of individuality, well-being, profitability. To establish that then becomes a life mission. It becomes a life goal. And it also becomes the struggle of life, because the struggle of life highlights how difficult it is to establish principle for yourself as a life principle, and to live by that life principle in what you do, in what you say, in how you think, and in how you live. Until the next time on the Derek Evans Show, where we talk about the Shinsei method and other topics relevant to you, to your business, to your work, to your family, to your life.